Hey, I'm Alex, and today I'm going to be taking a look at Super Resolution, a new feature just added to Adobe Camera Raw. Want to see how you can quadruple your camera's resolution with one click? Check out this comparison of Super Resolution and its closest competitor. Let's start by taking a look at how you actually activate Adobe's Super Resolution feature. Here I've got a raw image opened up in Adobe Camera Raw, and I right-click on it and select Enhance. From here, you can actually see that there are two options. The first was one that was already in Photoshop. That's the Enhanced Details feature. The second is now Super Resolution. This one doubles the image resolution on each axis, actually giving you kind of quadruple the resolution. So you go from a 10 megapixel image to 40 megapixels, as well as also giving you the benefits of that Enhanced Details option. So with Super Resolution active, you can see here in the little preview window that before and after. Not a huge difference just in this little preview window, but when you see that it actually applies it and you compare it to the original, it really does make quite a difference. So to get started, we'll apply that and it'll work for a few seconds and generate a DNG file back where this file was originally set up that now has the quadruple resolution applied. You can actually see here that it also drops it into the film strip. So you don't have to navigate back there to open it. You can instead just choose to open that file right in Photoshop. Now that new file is going to take a few seconds to open, as you can see there, because it's actually quite big now. In that case, that was a Z7 file, so a 45 megapixel file that is now about 160 some odd megapixels. And it still retains a lot of that raw file information. So you can actually go in and make those color adjustments that you might want to make to a raw file and still have kind of all of that detail there to work with. So you can see here that I can pull back the highlights. I can change the color temperature quite significantly and still really have all of that headroom with, to post-process with that you would expect to have in a RAW file. So that's one of the big things that I like about Super Resolution is how tightly integrated it is into the existing Photoshop workflow. Now, as it stands right now, this Super Resolution feature isn't in Lightroom, but according to the blog post, it will be coming to Lightroom soon. When that happens, I'll definitely want to check it out because I think having it built into Lightroom will make it even more useful. So that's Super Resolution. Now let's jump over to the other program, Topaz's Gigapixel AI. Here's Gigapixel AI, and you can see that if you were to drag and drop in the file, it'll open up and it'll generate a preview, or at least start to generate a preview once it actually loads in. And what you can see here is you've got quite a few more options on the side. With Super Resolution, it's pretty much one click. Do you want it or not? And here you have a few more choices to make. You can choose different scaling factors, different AI modes, and what that actually is going to do is that's going to change the kind of neural network, the model that's used to render out the new details. You can pick between standard, architectural, compressed, and art. But from here, I'll go ahead and save out the image to my desktop as a TIFF file. And this brings me to kind of the first issue with Gigapixel AI versus Photoshop's implementation, and that is the speed. Now, I'm running a relatively middle of the range computer. It's a 3700X processor and a 2070 RTX graphics card. And while that's by no means the fastest stuff available on the market, perfectly competent. And the problem is that Gigapixel AI really chugs. In Photoshop's case, it would be anywhere from 3 to 7 seconds to render out one of those finished images. Gigapixel AI is anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes. And so I'm really not super impressed with that performance, especially, spoiler alert again, once you get down to the comparisons and see just how close these images are and just how much Photoshop can actually beat Gigapixel AI's results in some cases. So now that we're back in Photoshop, I actually want to take a look at a sample style of image that everybody might not shoot, but that I actually think shows off some of the differences between these two approaches the best, and that's actually an aerial image. I selected this for actually a few main reasons. The first is that it's one of the domains where you probably will need the most resolution improvement possible, thanks to the smaller sensor size on a drone. For instance, these images come from a Mavic Air 2, which has a 12 megapixel, they say 48 megapixel, but it's quad sampled down. So let's call it 12 megapixel sensor. With a kind of atypical color filter array. It's that quad Bayer color filter. And long story short, because of the small sensor size, the weird color filter array, you can get some noise even low ISOs in broad daylight, and the resolution isn't amazing. Now, for a camera that can fly around up in the air at 40 miles per hour, it's quite impressive and quite an improvement over drones from just a few years ago. But this is kind of one of the domains where camera technology isn't at its apex. I think right now for DSLR and mirrorless cameras, anything from entry level up can deliver a really good image if you know what you're doing and take the right steps. But I think with a drone, you can always benefit from more resolution and a greater improvement in image quality in post-processing. And so I'm always looking for a way to kind of optimize my post-processing technique. And so with that in mind, I wanted to take a look at these aerial images first. On the top will be Gigapixel's image, and below that will be Photoshop's. So the first area that I actually wanted to take a look at is going to be down here. And in this version, this is the Photoshop one, you can see here this sign that says hotel is relatively intelligible as hotel, and the areas of dirt and the sides of the building are all pretty neutral textures. There isn't a very strong pattern to them, and they're just, pretty inoffensive. As you jump over to the Gigapixel image, which is what we're now looking at, you can see the first issue that I have with it, which is to personify the machine learning model here. I would almost say it's a little bit hallucinatory. It's making up things that are not there in the original image and aren't there in real life. And one of the most prominent examples of that is the hotel sign, which has now taken on really heavy artifacting and false color. And looking over at the side of the fence, side of the wall here, you've got it kind of making up these patterns that aren't present on the image, aren't present on the actual building, aren't present in the original image. I first noticed this back with my Fuji X-T1. It would handle areas of like repeated natural green textures, trees, bushes, that sort of thing, really oddly. At the time, people on the internet characterized it as wormy. I like to call it watercolor, but what it actually ends up being is, in this case, this is the Photoshop version, everything pretty much still looks like a tree. It might not have a ton of detail, it might not have a ton of micro contrast, but it's pretty much recognizable as a tree, a saguaro, a cactus. Jumping over to Gigapixel's version here, you can see that it has taken on this really weird kind of like stirred watercolor look. And part of that is kind of intrinsic to weird color filter array sensors, but it seems to only be magnified in combination with Gigapixel's propensity to imagine detail where there isn't any. Overall, I'm really pleased with the Photoshop one. I absolutely think that it turns a regular resolution file into effectively a 40-some megapixel file and does a very convincing job of it. So here's that comparison of a kind of architectural travel shot here for my Z7, run through both Photoshop Super Resolution and Gigapixel AI. Just to get your bearings, this top image is the one that's gone through Gigapixel AI, and it's a little bit lower contrast, and again, notably, without lens corrections, is going to be a bit different in kind of framing and field of view. You can see that here as I turn off Gigapixels and jump over to Photoshop's. So the first is going to actually be how the stars are handled on the flags. Now, in the original image, there is not a ton of resolution on these stars, but what Gigapixel does is basically turn the stars into smudges, and I think most problematically, adds weird coloration to them. Now, as you can see here, these aren't stars and they aren't the white stars on a blue field that you would expect. Instead, it almost looks like a pattern of stars in the night sky with all sorts of, little twinkling colors in them. Jumping over to Photoshop's version, you can see there is still some false coloration to them, which I would actually probably go in and address in ACR. The Gigapixel version here has completely smoothed the awning out to almost a entirely matte texture. Same with the detail on the building itself. Now keep in mind that was at default settings. You could maybe dial down the noise reduction. I don't know if this is a case of Gigapixel being overly aggressive, but that's what it spit out. And you can see here, there's actually kind of detail up in this marble or granite. There's a bit of detail and still a bit of noise in the sax sign, but I think it gives a much more natural result. Instead of kind of trying to look like an illustration, it looks like a photo. It looks like a photo that's been, somewhat upscaled. I don't know if I would even consider this to be 4x upscaled, but here at, 150 some % zoom, it still looks perfectly natural and holds up, quite well to close inspection. Jumping over to one of the other problem areas I noticed with Gigapixel was this chain link fence. Now, Photoshop didn't handle this perfectly either. I think partly it's a little blur. Gigapixels here is, again, starting to look very painterly. It almost looks like you had somebody go in with a brush and do a matte painting of a chain link fence over the surface of it. In comparison, I have to say I liked the Photoshop version better across every image that I tested. And for it to now be built into Photoshop and eventually coming to Lightroom, I'm really excited to add this in my workflow in a way that I never found a need to integrate or a desire to integrate Topaz's version into my workflow. So I hope you enjoyed this comparison. Let me know, have you tried out Photoshop's super resolution feature yet? And how does it work for you on portraits or nature shots? I don't have a huge portfolio of those to test out on. I'd be curious to hear your experiences with that. Furthermore, do you find a need for really dramatically upscaling your images? I know that nowadays a lot of cameras are offering, 36, 45, 50 megapixels or even more. And so do you think there's still going to be a need for this going forward? I know that I see it with drones, and I'd even like to have it for some of these travel images where I might not be able to stitch a panorama, but would like to be able to print them bigger. So I can see using it, but what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for joining me.